kutuka vamwe vasina kuvota. Register kuvota, hande kunovota. Hatidi vanozopopota, kutuka vamwe vasina kuvota. Proof of residency, nechitupa changu ndeta check ndapinda tonazi. Monazi, ndoda kunyorejesa masalazi. Maketo yuzi yakamejesa, vemushika-shika pamusika varikutengesa. Kuti ugokwanisa kuvota paunoda, manya kuseki orejesa kuvota. Register kuvota, hande kunovota. Hatidi vanozopopota, kutuka vamwe vasina kuvota. Register kuvota.
Register to vote and stand with other citizens in voting to be the change our country needs. Stand in solidarity with others to bring dignity into the lives of all Zimbabweans. Here is the list of the ZEC Provincial Offices. Please phone for free on 08080219 for more information. In Bulawayo Metropolitan Province, the offices are located at number 16 Centenary Court, Windsor Park Building, 16th Avenue, in Famona, Bulawayo. Harare Metropolitan is at 95 Jason Moyo Avenue, 4th floor Cecil House, in Harare. In Manicaland, they can be found at 1st floor, New Government Complex, corner Robert Mugabe and 4th Street in Mutare. In Mashonaland Central, they are located at 2nd floor, Mutunga Gore Building in Bindura. In Mashonaland East, they are located at number 2, 5th Street, Marondera. In Mashonaland West, the address is 78 Robson Manika Drive in Chinoi. Mashingo can be found at number 10, Hellet Street in Mashingo. And for Midlands, the address is 10th Street, ground floor Government Complex in Gweru. Matabeleland North can be found at 16 Centenary Court, Windsor Park Building, 16th Avenue in Famona, Bulawayo. And Matabeleland South is located at 1194 Big Ben Road, Chahunda in Gwanda. Your vote counts.
America, Part 2. In Part 2 of today's letter from America, Mnangagwa and ZANU PF appalling record of human rights violations will continue to be spotlighted. Some people have asked why we should continue to talk about these gross human rights violations in Zimbabwe. They argue that these violations and atrocities are well documented and spread all over the internet, especially the social media, for the whole world to see. The best and most appropriate answer to this question was given by former President of Tanzania, the late Julius Nyerere, during the fight against apartheid in South Africa from the 1960s to the 1990s. Nyerere said he was asked the same question, why Africa should continue to talk about the evils of apartheid when the whole world knew what apartheid had done to the Africans in apartheid South Africa. In his response, Nyerere said, we speak and must continue to speak about the evil system of apartheid, not because apartheid, like Mount Kilimanjaro, is there for all to see, but because, unlike Mount Kilimanjaro, apartheid must be removed from the face of this earth. In today's post-colonial Zimbabwe, Nyerere's statement on apartheid is a fitting narrative on the evils of human rights violations and atrocities. Human rights activists and members of the opposition parties, especially the MDC alliance led by advocate Nelson Chamisa, continue to spread the word about the ongoing atrocities and human rights violations in Zimbabwe. Not because they are ever present in the lives of Zimbabweans, but because they must be stopped in order to give the embattled Zimbabweans some breathing space and to truly enjoy the fruits of independence and freedom. It is now very well known that violence, corruption, and human rights violations are the defining characteristic of Mnangagwa and ZANU PF. And the big question in the minds of many people is, will Zimbabweans ever in their lifetime enjoy peace, freedom, and independence at all? Or are Zimbabweans doomed to perpetually groaning under the iron heel of Mnangagwa and ZANU PF despotic rule? Yet another question. Is it at all possible that Mnangagwa and ZANU PF will ever stop politically motivated violence and human rights abuse against Zimbabwe, or stop corruption, or stop rigging elections? Is that at all possible? Those are two historic and national questions for Zimbabweans. All indications are that ZANU PF survival is based on depriving Zimbabweans of their fundamental rights, human rights. ZANU PF has been ruling or misruling Zimbabwe since independence in 1980. That is 42 years ago. To understand the nature and practice of violence and corruption by ZANU PF, it is worthwhile to look at its historical origins. But before we do that, let us remember that the history of ZANU PF violence is instructive for most Zimbabweans. Why? Because 75% of the Zimbabwean population was not born before 1980, when Zimbabwe gained independence. This is roughly 7 out of 10 Zimbabweans are the so-called born free in quotes. They are the ones who are suffering the most from ZANU PF violations of their human rights and politically motivated violence. It would be understandable that these youngsters may well feel clueless on how to deal with the oppressive Mnangagwa and ZANU PF system. By the way, and ironically, there was a time when the use of violence to liberate oppressed people was supported by the international law and even religion. ZANU PF's ZANLA and ZAPU's ZIPRA freedom fighters engaged in violence as an instrument for liberation from white settler colonial rule from the 1960s to 1980. This violence was an acceptable international standard for resisting oppressive rule. In the 1970s, the World Council of Churches was divided on whether to support the liberation movements. Church delegates, especially from Europe and North America, argued that it was against the teachings of Christianity to engage in violence. However, delegates from the African, Asian, and South American churches counter-argued that the Christian church sanctioned violence if it was intended to liberate the oppressed peoples. They mentioned the freeing of the children of Israel from the Pharaoh in Egypt and other acts of violence reportedly sanctioned by God, especially in the Old Testament, as examples of church-sanctioned violence. Incidentally, biblical scholars, historians, and archaeologists have not found any evidence that the children of Israel were ever enslaved in Egypt or built the pyramids. The most powerful argument for the use of violence to free the oppressed people was made by African theologians in the 1970s. They argued that the Christian church cross was originally used as oppressive violence to crucify Christians by the Romans. Now, the same cross is widely used in churches as liberation theology. Liberation theology generally refers to theology applied to the core elements of marginalized communities in need of social, political, or economic equality and justice. In summary, ZANU and ZAPU armed struggle enjoyed support from the international law and the liberation theology. However, when independence came in 1980, Zimbabwe was supposed to transform into a country that respected and upheld the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. There was no more room for any kind of politically motivated violence except when it came to suppressing criminal activities under the rule of law. In his address to the nation in 1980, the then Prime Minister Robert Mugabe made an impassioned appeal for unity and reconciliation. He said conflict and violence must now be a thing of the past, and that it was time for all Zimbabweans to work together to develop the new nation of Zimbabwe for the benefit of all. But the same Mugabe did not live up to the promise of a peaceful and democratic Zimbabwe where the citizens enjoyed their basic human rights. 3 years after independence, and for 4 years, the same Mugabe, actively assisted by Mnangagwa, was to massacre more than 20,000 innocent civilians in Matabeleland. The same Mugabe was also to engage in a systematic violation of human rights and violence against opposition parties until he was overthrown in a military coup in 2017. But Mugabe's overthrow did not mean the end of oppressive rule and violation of human rights in Zimbabwe. Mugabe's successor, President Mnangagwa has continued the same authoritarian rule in the country. A big question here is, why did ZANU PF continue to use violence after independence in 1980? And I want to stress here, politically motivated violence. The party had won by nearly 60% in the elections leading to independence in 1980. And Mugabe himself had, in an address to the nation, signaled a repudiation of politically motivated violence, which he described as a thing of the past. Why did Mugabe and ZANU PF go back to politically motivated violence against perceived opponents, notably ZAPU and ZIPRA freedom fighters? According to some ZIPRA ex-combatants, in a series of interviews, Mugabe's speech about reconciliation, democracy, and human rights was a deceptive propaganda aimed at hiding his real agenda to inflict violence, especially on ZAPU. That agenda was hinted at in a speech by top ZANU PF official Minister Ino Singala. In November 1980, he addressed a rally at White City Stadium in Bulawayo and told the audience that ZAPU must be liquidated. Nkala also said ZANLA ex-combatants and supporters had been given instructions on how to destroy ZAPU. Nkala also addressed rallies around Matebeleland and made similar inflammatory statements. Almost immediately after these speeches, fighting broke out between ZANLA and ZIPRA ex-combatants. In 1982, the Minister of Labor, the late Kumbirai Kangai, told a closed-door meeting with a group of journalists from the state media in Bulawayo that ZANU PF would never renounce violence and would not hesitate to use it if the party was ever threatened in any way. Kangai talked about a policy that he called democratic centrism. This meant, he said, that ZANU PF had allowed free and fair elections leading to independence in 1980. But once ZANU PF won, that democratic space would be closed for good because it was the party's intention to rule the country indefinitely. What exactly did Kangai mean by that? Any elections after 1980 were not intended to replace ZANU PF, but to please the international community into thinking Zimbabwe was now a democratic country that respected human rights and the rule of law, he said, adding that ZANU PF stood ready to use the instruments of force to stay in power. Mugabe repeated this notion of democratic centrism when he, time and again, said the ballot could not replace the bullet. In one very emotional speech, Mugabe said, "The ballot cannot replace the bullet. No, no, no. We say no. We want this country through the armed struggle, not the bullet." One school teacher who was intimidated by the ZANU thugs during the campaign for the 2008 elections said, They are saying we will die if we don't vote for Robert Mugabe and ZANU PF. That there will be war if we don't vote for Robert Mugabe. ZANU PF notion of democratic centrism is undoubtedly inspired by the Chinese policy of economic development without democracy. This Chinese model involves a highly centralized government whose party, the Chinese Communist Party, rules indefinitely. No other party is allowed or tolerated. Another motivation for ZANU PF is the Machiavellian political philosophy. Niccolò Machiavelli was an Italian diplomat, author, philosopher, and historian who lived during the Renaissance in 16th century Italy. Machiavelli, in his book The Prince, argued that a successful ruler is brutal, calculating, and when necessary, utterly immoral. The successful ruler must use brute force if he is to survive. Machiavelli also argued that a successful ruler must not rely on the love of the people to stay in power, because that love can be taken away when people see another charismatic ruler. Instead, a successful ruler must rely on the fear of the people, because fear cannot be taken away and people will always be subservient to the ruler. The Chinese model on economic development without democracy and the Machiavellian philosophy of ruling by instilling fear are the cornerstones or foundations of the ZANU PF rule in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe celebrated, for lack of a better word, 41 years of independence. The country has known only two leaders, the late Robert Mugabe, who was prime minister from 1980 to 1987, and then became president from 1987 to 2017, and Emmerson Mnangagwa, who ousted Mugabe in 2017 in a military coup. The ZANU PF ruling party has been in power since independence. Hopes for a change in the country's economic and political fortunes have been dashed because of misrule, corruption, and violations of human rights. Zimbabweans have suffered untold hardships over the years, many fleeing to neighboring countries like South Africa and abroad for better prospects. Among Zimbabwe's problems are the unstable currency, drought, water shortages, job cuts, clampdown on activists, media and opposition, and unpaid salaries for public servants. Some ZANU apologists now argue that, well, Mugabe is gone, there's a new president for Zimbabwe. Why should you keep bringing up whatever happened during Mugabe's rule? He is no longer there. He is no longer here. The answer is yes, indeed, Mugabe is gone. But he has been replaced by his carbon copy, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was in Mugabe's government for all the 41 years since independence, 42 years now. So it's a deja vu situation. Different presidents, only two since the independence, but same continuous violence, corruption, and violation of human rights. To quote again from the late Julius Nyerere, we must continue to speak about politically motivated violence, corruption, and violations of human rights in Zimbabwe, not because, like Mount Kilimanjaro, these violations are there for all to see, but because, unlike Mount Kilimanjaro, these violations and this corruption must be removed from the face of the earth. The year 2021 ended on a very gloomy note for Zimbabweans. It looks like it will be a long and hard struggle until Zimbabweans can enjoy true democracy, independence, and respect for human rights. But as the late Samora Machel always said, a luta continua. This concludes today's letter from America. Thank you for listening.
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening.